My task is to give you an outlook for the 2022-23 wet season and going forward through the year. But to give that context, we need to think about what's happened in the weather and climate space during the past 3 years, because it's been fairly unusual. We've had 3 La Ninas in a row, and for those of you who work on the land, that means additional rainfall in lots of tropical Australia and also in eastern Australia. So let's have a little bit of a look at how that's affected us. Yeah, so looking at the rainfall totals over the past 3 years, what you can see in those maps there on the left-hand side, the blue colours represent well above average rainfall. So you can see right across the Kimberley and Cape York Peninsula, you've got well above average rainfall. And that's over the 3 years from, I guess, the latter part of 2020 through to 2023. And it's been quite anomalous, really, because 3 La Ninas in a row means that there's been quite a build-up of moisture in the landscape and in the soil. So you're probably all aware of the impacts of that in eastern Australia and northern Australia in terms of flooding. So as the soils get saturated, the runoff increases, and every additional bit of rain that you get then ends up exacerbating flooding situations. So I guess as a result of this fairly unusual climate situation, we've seen some extraordinary and extreme flooding, and regrettably that's had a lot of impacts on communities through the tropical north, but also in eastern Australia. When we look at the breakdown of that rainfall, an additional effect has been additional rainfall in the lead-in to the wet season. So the transition season from the dry to the wet, we've seen quite a bit of additional rainfall, and that's in part due to another climate driver that we often talk about, what's called the Indian Ocean dipole. But all that tells you is that the sea temperatures around northern Australia, especially to the northwest, have been warmer than average right through the last 3 years. And as a result of that, moisture feeds in over the continent, and any weather system that lifts that air then produces additional rainfall. So it's an interesting sort of evolution of climate change, you might say, in that the atmosphere is able to it's warmer, it's able to hold more moisture, and as a result you get heavier rainfall and worse flooding. So it's a sort of a bit of a feedback cycle. However, going forward, we may see quite a change in the climate drivers as we move through this year. Just reflecting on those rainfalls around northern Australia, we had a lot of rain in the beginning of the wet season last year, but in the Territory, our wet season actually kind of stopped in January and February. So when we look at the maps for the last 3 seasons, but especially for the last season, there's been a deficit of rainfall around parts of the top end of the Territory. So there are some patches and holes in that distribution of increased rainfall. But moving forward into the 2022 dry season, the influence of that La Nina had a profound effect on producing regular rains right through the dry season. And you can see that signature in the left-hand panel on the display, with those blue colours from the northwest to the southeast across the Territory and into Queensland. So that really represents the moisture influx during the dry season and the unusual rains which occurred. There were some fairly significant rainfalls in the Territory around Tennant Creek and northwards during the season. And I guess what's unusual is that we had repeated rainfall events right through the dry season, so keeping the grass growth going in the tropical north at the very least. The other factor in the 2 right-hand panels is the yellow colours represent above average temperatures, so minimum and maximum temperatures were on average above the long-term average for the last 30 years. And again, that's a flow-on effect of climate change, where we're seeing sea temperatures increasing around tropical Australia, and that has an effect on the temperatures over the land as well. So not only are we seeing increased rainfall, we're also seeing increased heat waves as well. So moving into the wet season, again, that trend of increased rainfall continues, and you can see the blue shades on the left-hand map showing above average rainfall right through northern Australia and eastern Australia as well. And really the only area that missed out was inland parts of Western Australia. And temperatures have been above average in the tropical north, but below average over much of continental Australia, and that's due to an increase in humidity and cloud, I guess, across the continent. So a fairly unusual wet season already as we're moving into it, with above average rainfall, and especially you can see the blue shades around the Kimberley representing the high rainfalls in that area, which have contributed to the increased flooding that we've seen in the Fitzroy this season. So going forward, looking ahead into the dry season, that La Nina influence is forecast to decrease as we move forward, and we're going to go back to what we call ENSO-neutral conditions, where there's no strong drivers one way or the other, and that is expected to extend through autumn or the tail end of the wet season. And the other influence, the Indian Ocean dipole, doesn't have an effect at this time of year, but it may kick in as we move to the dry season. The other climate driver you may have heard of is the Madden-Julian oscillation, but that just is a cycle that occurs on a monthly or month and a half sort of time scale, and it helps to amplify the rainfall around Australia as it passes. So we've just been through a positive phase of that oscillation, where we've seen quite a few cyclones develop around northern Australia, and that's moving away now. So in the short term, we're expecting a bit of a drying trend in northern Australia, and as we move forward, the outlooks also show a drying trend more generally as we move through the dry season. So here's some maps showing modelling forecasts for the next 3 months, March, April and May. And the red colours represent below average rainfalls in the left-hand map. In the right-hand map. The orange colours represent below average rainfall, and the two, the left and the centre, are maximum and minimum temperatures. And the red shows the chance of exceeding average maximum temperatures. So in the left-hand panel, you can see the tropical north. There's some red shades across the top end, Cape York, for both maximum and minimum temperatures being above average. But also there's a great swath across southern and central Australia where we're predicting above average temperatures. So clear skies and below average rainfall is basically the expectation for the next 3 months or so. And the little maps below the orange and the red maps are the reliability of the forecast. So the stronger the green colour, the more reliable it is. So you can see that in those maps of rainfall, the reliability of the rainfall forecast in the northern part of Australia is quite high, as shown by the dark green colours. So we have a fairly high confidence in this forecast going forward. And we also have some modelling which shows the probability of extremes. So this is the top 20% of the climate record. So in the left-hand panel here, you can see the chance of unusually wet conditions, and that's fairly neutral. But the chance of unusually dry conditions in the right-hand panel is shown by those yellow shades. And so unusually dry conditions, meaning in the lowest 20% of rainfalls, are possible through Central Australia and Southern Australia during the next 3 months. And along with that, temperatures, there's a chance of anomalously warm temperatures as well, as shown by the orange shades in this map. So this is the sort of prediction for the early part of the dry season and the end of the wet. But going forward from there, just extending the outlook out to July, you can see the orange shades in that right-hand panel are rainfall, and the orange shades represent a high probability of not reaching average rainfall. So right across Australia, a drying trend is forecast. And the left-hand panel, the red shades show much warmer than average conditions as well. So warmer and drier is the outlook going into the dry season. The other thing to consider, and it's been talked about in the media a bit, is the possibility of an El Nino developing. And, what this basically means is that rainfall across the Australian continent will be suppressed. And generally an El Nino will kick in springtime and extend into summer. So the question is whether this is going to happen this year. And it has happened in the past, where a La Nina has been followed by a El Nino. And current modelling suggests that El Nino is a possibility as we move into the next wet season, but unfortunately that modelling has a low certainty at this time of year. So we can say it's a possibility and it's worth factoring it into your planning for fires and landscape management, but it's not a sure thing as yet. But the impacts of El Nino in the tropical north are generally increased trade winds in the latter half of the dry season, so windier, hotter conditions, and a general suppression of rainfall. So we're unlikely to see those cloud bands with the rainfall right across the continent that we saw in the last dry season. So it's well worth considering that El Nino may be a possibility as we move towards the next wet season. And the other background thing that we need to bear in mind is the trends that have occurred as a result of the warming of the seas and the atmosphere. And you can see, I know it's not very clear, but those vertical lines represent the number of what are called extreme heat days. So they're the days when there's a significant heat wave across a large part of Australia. And you can see the frequency of those has really increased in the last 20 to 30 years. And particularly in 2019, which you may recall as being a fairly significant fire season even in the tropical north of Australia. So 2019 is the highest point on that graph on the right-hand side there. And moving into this season, we may expect those extreme heat days to start increasing again as that La Nina influence decreases. So we see less cloudiness, more heat, and more stagnant air masses across Australia. And the impact of that means an increase in dangerous fire weather days. And this map shows a comparison between two periods. There's the 30 years up to 1986, I think it is, and then the 30 or so years since then. And the red colours represent an increase in the fire danger days above a certain threshold. So you can see that those days which have dangerous fire weather have increased right across the tropical north, especially in the Kimberley and the top end and Cape York Peninsula, but also down the east coast of Australia. So these are trends which are occurring over a long time period and are not expected to change in the short term. So based on our forecast of drying conditions for this wet season, for this dry season coming and going into the next wet season, we also have this background sort of trend of an increase in temperature and fire danger as well. So these maps are available in the Bureau of Meteorology's annual climate statement, so you can have a look at those if you want. And that's all I have for you today, so thank you very much for listening, and happy to take some questions.